Hey everyone, this is John. I had a few questions about this image and how it was processed in Lightroom. So I thought I'd record a screen cap and show you kind of what my thought process is. Now I'm no expert in Lightroom, but maybe I've found out a few things along the way, and it might give you some insights. So let's get going. This is the original capture. Now you see it's blown out here at the sun, which is to be expected, of course. And well, it's actually not too bad, I guess, for the conditions I was shooting in. The first thing I'll always do is adjust my lens correction. So if you have a look here, you'll see that there's a purple fringe here, which happens on pretty much all lenses. It'll either be a purple fringe or a blue fringe. In the corners, where there's a high contrast, you'll see that. Now, if I enable the profile correction and I enable remove chromatic aberration, assuming that it has detected the lens correctly, which I can set here, it does that automatically for me, it'll actually remove that chromatic aberration. Here's with the correction turned off, and this is corrected. And you can, I hope you see it in the video, there's a tiny bit of purple going on there. So what it'll also do is it'll correct any barrel distortion that your lens has. So that's that versus that, which is handy, I guess. So let's have a look at the histogram. There are things blown out. The sky is blown out, but there's still detail in there in the raw file. If I reduce the exposure, you'll see. Yeah, you can actually make out the mountains there in the back and some clouds. So yeah, we can play around with that a bit. And what I'll usually do first of all is adjust my exposure so I like the way the rocks look, or the midtones look. So the exposure kind of determines where my midtone is. And actually, I think this is kind of okay. Then I'll check my blacks and whites. I'll drag, keeping the Alt key down here, and it'll show me what's clipping in the white channel as I drag my white slider. So that's probably about right. Let's see how that is. -60 versus 0. Yeah, could actually probably come all the way down. Yeah, it'll do for now. We're going to revisit this a little later anyway, because I have something else in mind as well. But this is more or less the process I usually do. So the blacks, I do the same with that. I keep the Alt key pressed and then drag my blacks up or down until I start seeing a little bit of clipping. A bit of clipping is okay, I think, depending on what the subject is, of course. So that's okay there. I mean, this is black. This is really in the shadows. It's supposed to be dark. So now I can adjust my highlights. That's just pretty much to taste. You see the sky, bringing back a bit of detail into the sky. That's probably about it. The shadows is the darks, so that's the rocks in the foreground and the rocks on the opposite shore. I kind of like it, kind of contrasty. That's okay, like that for now. Now I'm going to bring up the clarity quite a bit. I don't usually add too much clarity because it can make an image look way too crunchy and kind of HDR-like, over-processed. That's too much. So I'll back it off a bit till about there, I think. Yeah, that'll do. And when I adjust the clarity, I always check if there's any glowing happening around areas of high contrast. So in this case, it would be this area here, which might start to glow if I add too much clarity or sharpness. And you know, actually, it's not too bad. Can't see any glowing here. There's a bit here, but that's also kind of the mist over the valley with the sun. Yeah, it looks okay. And I'm going to add some vibrance. What vibrance does, it has a look at the colors in your image, especially in the midtones, and it compensates for the colors that are missing. So in this case, I could do with a bit more blue. I know there's blue in the ice, and there you go. You can see it coming in there. I could go over the top. That's too much. I could actually do this and then bring the saturation down. That's another technique I often use. So go way up on the vibrance, which is like a localized saturation, and then drag the saturation slider down a bit, which is a global saturation. But in this case, I'm just going to use the vibrance about there. Now I've got a calibrated monitor, but of course when you export to the internet, sRGB, there's going to be changes here. So in the end, what I'm going to have to do is export it to sRGB, have a look at it in Chrome, which doesn't have any color management of any kind. It's pretty crappy in that sense. And then we'll have a look later. There's a bit of lens flare going on here. I could remove that. I could adjust that. I could say desaturate this area, but I kind of like it. It's not too bad. But I can show you how you do that if you like. What you do is you take the adjustment brush, and what I'm doing is dragging saturation down and then just painting in here, and that'll remove any color, in this case green, from that area. And now it's a bit bright as well, so I'll probably have to increase the contrast and decrease the exposure a little bit. There we go. Yeah, that takes care of that. Okay, so let's have a look. The next thing I usually do, before going off on a tangent like this, is I'll have a look at my vignetting. I kind of like a bit of vignetting in my images. So that happens right down here at the bottom, and I can dial in the amount that I want. I'd say about there. Vignetting makes it darker in the corners, and it's actually a lens has vignetting to some extent, so it's kind of a natural effect. Some people try to remove it completely. I kind of like it, as long as it's not too much like this, unless that's there's an artistic reason to do that. Okay, that's kind of nice, but I like my vignetting to extend a little bit more into the middle, so I can do that by dragging the midpoint, say around there. Yeah, that's about it. And I can make the transition a bit smoother by adjusting the feather around there. What I'll often do is actually drag the midpoint all the way to the left, so I have a total vignette, and drag the feather all the way to the right so that it's really smooth. But in this case, I think we'll just undo those changes, and that'll do quite nicely. Now I've got highlight priority turned on, so I can adjust the amount of highlights that bleed through the vignette. I think that's about right. And you can see that happening up here in the sky, where the highlight interacts with the vignette. So I can turn it completely off. Hey, if it's really bright, it has to stay really bright, or I can drag it down. I think that's okay like that. It's on its default setting. Now then, let's see. The next thing I'll do is I'll add some split toning. Now what this does, excuse me, what this does is it adds a certain color to the highlights and a different color to the shadows. So instead of having like a color cast over your entire image, it'll add a slight tint to the highlights and a slight different tint to the shadows, and that gives a really nice effect sometimes. So which color to use? Well, the sun's shining, the sunlight was bright and yellow, so I think the highlights are going to be a yellowish tint in this case. And it's Iceland, so it's cold, so that's blue, so the shadows are going to be blue. So let's do that. So here I select which tint I want. That's going to be about this tint, I think. But hey, the saturation is way too much, so let's drag that down. I can either do that here. I can select my tint like this. So I can drag it here up and down to select the saturation, left and right to select the tint. So that's my tint. I can do it down here as well. And then the saturation will be way less than that. Around that, I think. Okay, let's see what that did. That's switched on and that's switched off. It's really subtle, but it makes a nice difference, I think. Let's do the same for the shadows. The shadow's going to be blue. So my hue will be approximately this, I think. Blue. So look if, yeah, that's a nice deep cold blue. But the saturation is going to be way less. About there, I think. Okay, let's see how that works. That's it switched on, and that's it switched off. On, off. So you see the rocks are kind of brownish here, but if I switch on the split toning, they get over a little bit of a nice blue tint. When using these split tonings, it's often often good idea to kind of follow color theory and use maybe complementary colors or adjacent colors, or have a look at things like what do they call it? The triad of colors. I'm not sure what it's called exactly, but so things like blue and yellow work really well together. Red and green, purple and orange, those sort of tints. Okay, this is starting to look rather good. Okay, let's have a look at the sharpening and the noise, because I've turned up my clarity quite a lot, so there may be a little bit of noise in there now. Zoom into 100%. When you go and adjust noise reduction and sharpening, always go to 100% because that's the only way you're going to see it. It's not too bad, the noise. You can see it here in the shadows. Some of that could be just the texture of the rock, but yeah, there's some noise in there. You can see it also up here in the dark parts of the mountains here. It's a little bit. So go down to noise reduction. Here we go. So we'll reduce the noise a little bit, not too much. That's probably okay. If you drag it up too much, then you start losing all the detail in your textures. So we don't want to do that. Even if you drag a detail slider up, noise reduction is you have to kind of watch out with that. Sometimes it's inevitable, but hey. Okay, And then sharpening. Any image coming out of a digital camera has to be sharpened. It's just the way the sensor works. So I could just sharpen it as much as I can, but then it'll sharpen the noise as well. So here you can see the noise is coming back here. And also it'll sharpen things that don't actually need sharpening. I only want to sharpen like the sharp edges, like here where the contrast is high. I don't really want to sharpen these kind of nice textures here. So I'll reduce that a fair amount. And what I'll also do is I'll adjust the masking. Now the masking determines which part of the image is sharpened. This is how much is sharpened, and the masking determines which part. Now if you hold down your Alt key and drag, then you'll start to see what parts are being sharpened. Whatever is white is being sharpened the most, whatever is black isn't sharpened at all, and the grey is kind of in the middle. Now I really only want the edges of those mountains sharpened and the major features of the rest of the image. So it will probably be about there, I think. Let's zoom out, see what it's done. Which parts have been sharpened. Yeah, it might still be a little bit too much. I could drag it all the way up and then you'll only get the major features, but somewhere in the middle there. That'll probably be okay. Now what I have to do is just have a look at the scene and zoom into a few places. Allow it to load, of course, and then tweak it. See what the effect is. Yeah, that's actually not too bad. Let's have a look over here at the mountains. How that's doing. That's pretty good. Let's see. Without sharpening and noise reduction, and with sharpening and noise reduction. So the sharpening also counteracts the noise reduction in certain areas a little bit. So let's see. Hello, Jeanette. Having a walk over there. I could clone you out, of course, but I think I'll leave you in there. This was one of my travel mates. Okay, now another technique I often use is to sort of add a pool of light where I want the viewer's eye to go. Now this is already quite bright, but I think we can add a little bit more interest in this area. And I'll use a radial brush to do that, to just sort of like cast a pool of focus and light and clarity, probably, to or maybe just exposure, I don't know, we'll see, to this area here. So it'll probably be about from here to the top of the steps. Yeah, that's about it. It's slightly off center. I think I want it a bit more off center. And I want to invert the mask because now it's adjusting everything. It's using my saturation here. Reset that. And increase the exposure a bit. Now everything outside of the circle is being adjusted, and I want that the other way around, of course. And with the feather I can adjust how soft the transition is. I want it all the way up. Now I can adjust the exposure a little. This is going to cause some parts of the snow to blow out, but hey, the snow is white. It's okay if little bits of it are clipped. I'd say about there. No, less. I'd say about there. But dragging this exposure up has caused the scene to come, pretty bright. And so I'm going to go back and I'm going to adjust my my overall exposures here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to darken the scene down quite considerably. Maybe about let's reset the highlights and the shadows and the whites and the blacks now first before I do this. Probably about that. And then I'll increase my whites considerably. About there. And blacks are probably about okay. Now I'm going to have to increase the shadows considerably as well. And this will bring back some interest here in the foreground. Bring down the highlights a little in the sky. There we go. Let's turn off that clipping indicator. This is kind of like the scene that I remembered. It's darker, more contrasty, a little moodier, with the nice dark, deep cyans and blues here in the water. Let's go back to my radial filter and maybe tweak that a little bit. I think I can bring that up a bit, and I could probably make it a bit bigger. There we go. I want to make sure that these little grassy things here remain nice and clear, because they're kind of my favourite part of the image. That looks quite good. Okay. Now, there's a few parts that I still don't like. The rocks here on the opposite bank can be quite a lot brighter and clearer, so I'm going to use my pen for that. Let's reset the settings first, and I'll dial in a bit of exposure so I can see what I'm doing. Make a nice big brush. I'm using a Wacom tablet to do this. And just painting in a bit of exposure here, making sure that my auto mask is switched off, because otherwise I'm going to get weird things in the shadows. And I can actually reduce the flow a bit further, so it's nice and slow, nice and even. There we go. Bringing a little bit more detail out here. Now let's have a look. I think I'll drop that a bit more, because I don't want everything to get brighter. To about there. I only want my shadows to get brighter, so let's bring those up. Now I can go quite a long way with this, because I dropped my overall exposure considerably, and as this is all additive, non-destructive, say, I can push the shadows quite a long way if I wanted to. But this is all a matter of taste. I think about there will do the trick. And we can probably add a bit of clarity to that. Maybe a little bit more shadows. When you drag one slider, you always have to kind of go back and tweak the other sliders. That'll be okay. See, we're operating on this area at the moment. Let's see. before and after. Brings up the lens flare a little bit as well. That's kind of nice. Excuse me. Now, a final touch, I think, is a little bit of burning and dodging of highlights and shadows. I'll often paint in a little bit more light on certain highlights that I want to have draw a little bit more attention to, a little more emphasis, and sometimes paint in a bit of burn in actually the shadows a little bit more, so make them darker, and it gives a bit more depth to the image. In this case, I think the shadows are probably dark enough, so I'll only dodge the highlights a little bit. So first of all, reset my brush. That's going to be okay. And let's up the exposure a bit. So I'll see what I'm doing. About 1.5. Probably increase the shadows a bit, and maybe increase the clarity a bit. This is kind of guesswork now, but we'll see what it does. Decrease the size of my brush a bit, and then I'll start dodging, making brighter little areas of highlight. Now this is very subtle, but it'll give a bit of dimension and a bit more depth, and sometimes a slight cartoonish or painterly feel to your image, which I kind of like. I rather prefer the painterly look to the absolutely photorealistic look. So here's some highlights over here I want, and over here, and maybe up here. It's mostly in the rock, maybe a little bit in the ice as well. It's actually very subtle, this, but I'll show you what it has done in a sec. Okay, anywhere over here? No, I don't think so. Maybe a little bit here, and so if I check this, you can see that the red parts are where it's been dodged, so that's kind of made lighter. And then we'll adjust the exposure to taste, the shadows. The clarity. It's really, really, really subtle, this, but okay. Okay. I kind of like that. Let's see how it compares to the one I prepared earlier. Yeah, this is slightly lighter. Let's see where the difference is. So here are my exposures. Now I've turned down my highlights a lot more here. So here actually the exposure is there we go, that's probably more like it. think I do want a bit more exposure here, especially as I'll be exporting it to sRGB for internet, and that's going to just darken everything down, especially the shadows. So a little bit I tend to err on the lighter side here. Okay, so that's pretty much it. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you soon. Cheers.